Imagine cleaning someone's floors for years while they treat you like you're invisible. Then one day they invite you to their wedding, but not to honor you,
To humiliate you.
to make you the joke of the evening in front of hundreds of wealthy guests. Most people would tear up that invitation and never look back. But Grace? Grace made a different choice. She walked into that Chicago ballroom in a navy blue gown that made every head turn. And when an old man gasped and said her name out loud, when he revealed that this janitor once ran a foundation that changed thousands of lives, when the entire room realized the bride had tried to humiliate a woman whose family name was legendary in that city, everything fell apart. The bride ran out in tears. The groom stood there in shock. And Grace? She stood tall, reminding everyone that dignity isn't something anyone can take from you. This story will break your heart and put it back together. Stay until the end, because what Grace does next will restore your faith in second chances. Welcome to Tales of Granny. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you are watching from. You know, sometimes people invite you places not because they want you there, but because they want to watch you suffer. That's exactly what happened to Grace. Grace was 42 years old. Every morning, she woke up at 5 a.m., put on her cleaning uniform, and went to work at the biggest office building in downtown Chicago. She mopped floors. She cleaned bathrooms. She emptied trash bins. She wiped windows until they sparkled like diamonds. Most people never even looked at her. They walked right past her like she was invisible, like she was just part of the furniture.
A mop.
A bucket. Nothing more. But Grace? She saw everything. She heard everything. Because when people think you're nobody, they talk freely. They don't guard their secrets. And Grace knew more about that building and the people in it than anyone could imagine. There was one person, though, who made sure Grace never forgot her place. Her name was Vanessa. Vanessa was young, beautiful, and married to the CEO of the company. She wore designer clothes every single day. Her heels clicked on the marble floors like a drumbeat announcing royalty. Her makeup was always perfect. Her hair was always styled. But her heart? Cold as ice. One day, Vanessa looked down at Grace and said, "Be careful with that floor. It costs more than everything you'll ever own." Grace said nothing. She just swallowed the insult and kept working. Because bills don't care about your pride. Life doesn't stop because someone treats you badly. But today was different. Grace was cleaning near the elevators when she saw Vanessa walking toward her with 3 of her friends. They were all dressed like they were going to a fashion show. They were laughing loudly, talking about expensive trips and designer bags. Grace stepped aside quietly, like she always did. She didn't want trouble. But Vanessa stopped right in front of her. "Grace," Vanessa said with a bright, fake smile. "I've been looking for you." Grace's heart sank. Whenever Vanessa came looking for her, it was never good news. Vanessa held up a fancy envelope. It was cream-colored with gold edges. The kind of invitation that costs more than Grace made in a week. "I have something special for you," Vanessa said sweetly. Too sweetly. She handed Grace the envelope. Grace stared at it. Something inside her screamed, "Don't take it. This is a trap." But she took it anyway. "It's a wedding invitation," Vanessa announced proudly. "Victor and I are getting married this Saturday at the Rosewood Grand Estate. And you're invited." Her friends giggled behind her. One of them covered her mouth, trying not to laugh out loud. Grace looked at the envelope, then at Vanessa. That's when she understood. This wasn't kindness. This was cruelty wrapped in gold paper. "Wear anything you like," Vanessa added with a smirk. "Just try not to show up in your uniform. We don't want people thinking you're there to clean." The women burst into laughter. Grace felt heat rising in her chest. Her hands trembled. But she refused to cry. She refused to look down. With a calm voice, she said just 2 words. "Thank you." Vanessa looked surprised for a second. She expected tears. She expected anger. But Grace just turned and walked away, holding that envelope like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Later that night, Grace sat in her small apartment. She opened the envelope and read the invitation. "You are cordially invited to the wedding of Vanessa Morgan and Victor Sterling. Saturday, 6 p.m. Rosewood Grand Estate. Black tie. Black tie. That means expensive dresses. High heels. Jewelry. Things Grace didn't own. Things Grace couldn't afford. She finally understood the plan. This wasn't an invitation. It was a setup. A public humiliation. They wanted her to show up looking poor and out of place, so everyone could laugh at her. Grace sat there for a long time, staring at that piece of paper. Part of her wanted to tear it up and throw it in the trash. Part of her wanted to pretend it never happened. But then she looked at the mirror across the room. She saw her tired eyes, her worn hands, her uniform still smelling like cleaning products. And something inside her whispered, "They think you're nobody. They think you don't matter. Maybe it's time to remind them who you really are." Because here's the truth that Vanessa didn't know. Grace wasn't always a janitor. Grace walked to her closet and pulled out a small wooden box from the top shelf. Her hands shook as she placed it on her bed. Inside were photographs. Old photographs. But these weren't pictures of the Grace everyone knew now. In these photos, Grace looked different. Confident.
Happy.
Powerful. She was standing in beautiful dresses, smiling with community leaders, cutting ribbons at charity events, shaking hands with government officials. At the bottom of the box was a certificate. The paper was old and worn, but the words were still clear. Grace Daniels, founder and executive director, Daniels Hope Initiative. Grace touched her own name with her fingertips. That was her. That was real. Her father had been a successful businessman. He owned properties all over Chicago. He gave jobs to hundreds of people. He built community centers. He mentored young entrepreneurs. Her mother had been a college professor, respected and loved by everyone who knew her. Grace grew up with everything: education, opportunity, purpose. She went to university. She started a foundation that gave scholarships to underprivileged students. She helped single mothers start businesses. She changed lives. Until everything fell apart. Money went missing. Not stolen by her, but stolen in her name. Court cases dragged on for years. Debts piled up. Her parents died within months of each other, their hearts broken by the scandal. Everything disappeared. The foundation.
The house.
The car. The reputation. All Grace had left was survival. And sometimes, survival means becoming invisible. But now, looking at those old photographs, something inside Grace woke up. She picked up her phone. Her hands were shaking. She scrolled through her contacts until she found a name she hadn't called in 5 years. Diane. Diane had been her best friend. A brilliant fashion designer who moved to New York to chase her dreams. Grace hesitated. Then she pressed call. The phone rang. Once.
Twice.
Then, hello? The voice sounded shocked. Diane, Grace whispered. It's me. It's Grace. And I need your help. The next morning, a black car pulled up in front of Grace's apartment building. The door opened, and out stepped Diane. She looked amazing. Stylish. Successful. Confident. Her sunglasses covered half her face. Her coat fit perfectly. Her boots clicked on the pavement with authority. When she saw Grace standing in the doorway, Diane's face lit up. She pulled off her sunglasses and ran forward, pulling Grace into a tight hug. "Oh my God," Diane whispered. "It's really you. I can't believe it's really you." Grace tried to speak, but her voice cracked. I didn't know who else to call. Diane held Grace's face in her hands and looked directly into her eyes. "Listen to me. You didn't call for help. You called for a reminder of who you've always been. And I'm here to make sure you never forget again." Inside the apartment, they spread the old photographs across the small kitchen table. Diane picked up each one, studying them carefully. "This is the Grace I remember," Diane said softly. "This is the woman who changed my life when I had nothing. You gave me my first grant to start my business. You believed in me when nobody else did." Grace looked down. "That was a long time ago." "No," Diane said firmly. "That was yesterday. Because that woman is still inside you. She never left. She's just been hiding." Diane pulled out her tablet and opened her design app.
All right. Tell me something.
When you walk into that wedding, how do you want them to see you? Grace thought for a moment. Then she lifted her head and spoke with a strength she hadn't felt in years. I want them to see the woman they tried to erase. And failed. Diane smiled slowly. A dangerous, beautiful smile. Then let's get to work. For the next 3 days, they worked like soldiers preparing for battle. Diane sketched designs. She made phone calls. She pulled in favors from contacts all over the fashion industry. Diane, I can't afford this, Grace said, looking at the fabrics and jewelry Diane was gathering. Diane held up her hand. Stop.
Don't insult me.
This isn't about money.
This is about dignity. And you don't put a price on that.
They chose a gown. Deep navy blue, like the ocean at midnight. Simple but stunning. Elegant but powerful. Diane opened her personal jewelry vault and pulled out a necklace. Silver, with a single sapphire stone in the center. This was my grandmother's, Diane said quietly. She wore it when she became the first woman in our family to own her own business. She always said, a queen doesn't need a crown. She just needs to know who she is. Grace's eyes filled with tears. The day before the wedding, they did a full rehearsal. Hair, makeup,
The dress.
the shoes, everything. When Grace finally looked at herself in the mirror, she gasped. She didn't recognize the woman staring back at her.
No.
That wasn't true. She did recognize her. She just hadn't seen her in a very long time. There she is, Diane whispered, standing behind her. There's the Grace I know. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about tomorrow. Part of her was terrified. What if she walked in and everyone laughed? What if Vanessa's plan worked? What if she became the joke they wanted her to be? But another part of her, a stronger part, whispered something different. What if you walk in and remind them that you were never the person they thought you were? The next morning, Grace woke up before sunrise. She didn't feel nervous anymore. She felt calm, focused, ready. Diane arrived at noon with the team. Hair stylist, makeup artist. Everyone treated Grace like she was royalty, because today she was. As they worked, Diane sat beside Grace and held her hand. No matter what happens today, Diane said softly, you've already won. Because you chose to show up. Not for them.
For you.
Grace squeezed her hand. Thank you. For everything. Diane smiled. That's what sisters do. By 5 p.m., Grace was ready. The navy blue gown fit her perfectly. It moved like water when she walked. The neckline was elegant, but modest. The fabric shimmered in the light. Her hair was styled in soft waves that framed her face. Her makeup was natural but glowing. The sapphire necklace rested perfectly against her collarbone. She slipped on the heels. Not too high. Just enough to make her stand tall. When she looked in the mirror one last time, she saw it clearly.
Dignity. Strength. Grace.
Not given to her by anyone. Not bought. Not borrowed. It was hers. It had always been hers. Diane stood at the door, watching with tears in her eyes. You ready? She asked. Grace took a deep breath. I'm ready. They walked down to the car. The driver opened the door. Grace slid into the back seat. As the car pulled away from the apartment, Grace looked out the window at the city passing by. This was the same city where she had once been respected. The same city where she had lost everything. The same city where she had learned to survive by becoming invisible. But today, she wasn't invisible anymore. Today, Grace was going to remind Chicago who she really was. The car drove through the streets of downtown, past the office building where she cleaned floors, past the neighborhoods where she once gave speeches and cut ribbons for new community projects. Finally, they turned onto a long, tree-lined road. At the end of it stood the Rosewood Grand Estate. It was massive, beautiful, intimidating. Luxury cars were parked everywhere. People in expensive clothes were walking up the grand staircase. Grace felt her heart beating faster. The car slowed down. It stopped right at the entrance. The driver stepped out and opened her door. Grace took one final deep breath. Then she stepped out of the car. and the world stopped. The first thing people noticed was the shoes. Navy blue heels, simple and elegant, stepping onto the white marble walkway. Then the dress. The gown moved like silk, catching the golden sunlight, shimmering with every step. It wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy, but it commanded attention. Then they saw her face.
Calm.
Confident. Beautiful. Grace walked slowly. Not rushing. Not hesitating. Just moving forward with quiet power. The entire entrance went silent. Guests stopped talking mid-sentence. Waiters holding champagne trays froze in place. A photographer lowered his camera, forgetting to take pictures. Everyone was staring. "Who is that?" someone whispered. "I don't know, but she looks important. Is she a celebrity? Maybe a politician?" Grace didn't look around nervously. She didn't search for approval. She just walked. The white carpet beneath her feet felt like her own personal runway. Every step echoed with purpose. Inside the estate, Vanessa was standing near the grand staircase, posing for photos. She wore a massive white gown covered in crystals. Her tiara sparkled under the chandeliers. She was laughing, showing off her ring, soaking in all the attention. Then she felt it. A shift in the air. The room had gone quiet. Vanessa turned around slowly, and her smile vanished. Her eyes widened. Her breath caught in her throat. Because walking through the entrance, looking like royalty, was Grace. Vanessa's mouth fell open. Her hands started shaking. The bouquet of flowers she was holding nearly slipped from her fingers. "No," she whispered.
No.
"This can't be happening." Victor, the CEO and groom, was standing nearby, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when he noticed the silence. His eyes landed on Grace. He blinked, then blinked again. His phone slipped from his hand and clattered onto the floor. Grace continued walking. She didn't rush. She didn't stop. She just moved through the crowd, like she owned the place. And in that moment she did. People stepped aside to let her pass. Not because they were told to, but because something about her presence demanded respect. Vanessa forced herself to move. She plastered a fake smile on her face and walked toward Grace, her heels clicking frantically on the marble. "Grace." Vanessa's voice was high-pitched, tight.
Wow.
I didn't think you'd actually come." She looked Grace up and down, her eyes darting across the gown, the jewelry, the hair, desperately searching for something to criticize. Grace turned her head slightly and gave Vanessa a small, calm smile. "You invited me," Grace said smoothly. "It would have been rude not to come." Vanessa's smile twitched. She gripped her bouquet tighter. "Well, you certainly dressed up," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Where did you even get that dress? Did you rent it?" Grace tilted her head slightly. Her voice was soft but sharp. "I could ask you the same thing," Grace said, glancing at Vanessa's over-the-top gown. "But I was taught that true elegance doesn't need to shout." A few people nearby gasped softly. Others tried to hide their smiles. Vanessa's face turned bright red. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Before she could say anything, an older gentleman stepped forward from the crowd. He had gray hair, a well-tailored suit, and kind eyes. He was staring at Grace like he'd seen a ghost. "Excuse me," he said slowly, stepping closer. "I'm sorry, but are you Grace Daniels?" The entire room went completely silent. Grace turned to face him. Her expression softened. "Yes," she said gently. "I am." The man's hand flew to his chest. His eyes filled with emotion. "My God," he whispered. "I worked with your father. I was on the board of the Daniels Hope Initiative. We helped build that community center on the South Side together." He stepped closer, his voice trembling. "Where have you been? We've been looking for you for years." Whispers exploded across the room like wildfire. "Daniels Hope Initiative? Wait, that Grace Daniels? The one who started all those scholarship programs?" I thought she disappeared. Vanessa felt like the ground was falling out from under her. Her legs wobbled. Her chest tightened. She had tried to humiliate a woman whose family name was legendary in this city. She had mocked someone who had done more good in 1 year than Vanessa had done in her entire life. The older man took Grace's hand in both of his. "Your father was one of the greatest men I ever knew," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And your mother, she taught half the kids in this city how to dream bigger. I'm so sorry for what happened to your family." Grace squeezed his hand gently. "Thank you," she said softly. "Life took me to places I never expected. But it didn't take everything. It didn't take who I am." More people began stepping forward. "I received a scholarship from your foundation," a young woman said, tears in her eyes. "I'm a lawyer now because of you." "My brother got his first job through your program," another man added. One by one, people who had been touched by Grace's work came forward. Some remembered her. Some only knew the stories. But all of them looked at her with respect, with gratitude, with awe. Victor stood frozen, watching everything unfold. His jaw was tight. His face had gone pale. He slowly turned to Vanessa. "What is this?" he asked quietly. His voice was low. "Dangerous." Vanessa's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her bouquet. "It was just a joke," she stammered. "I didn't know. I didn't think." "You didn't think?" Victor's voice was ice cold. "You invited this woman here to humiliate her. And you didn't even bother to find out who she was?" Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of shame. Grace stood in the center of the room, surrounded by people who remembered her, people who honored her, people who saw her for who she truly was. And for the first time in years, she felt seen. Not as a janitor. Not as someone broken. But as Grace Daniels. The woman who had changed lives. The woman who had built hope. The woman who had never truly disappeared. She had just been waiting. Waiting for the right moment to remind the world who she was. And that moment was now. The applause started softly. Just one person clapping. Then 2. Then 5. Then the entire estate erupted in applause. People stood from their seats. They clapped with genuine respect. Some had tears in their eyes. Others nodded slowly, as if finally understanding something important. Grace stood there, not with pride, but with quiet dignity. She didn't bow. She didn't wave. She just stood, acknowledging the moment. Because this wasn't about glory. This was about truth. Vanessa couldn't take it anymore. Her chest heaved. Her hands shook. The room was spinning around her. Everyone was looking at Grace, honoring Grace, applauding Grace, and completely forgetting about the bride. Vanessa's perfectly planned wedding, her moment to shine, her day to be the center of attention, was falling apart. She dropped her bouquet. The flowers scattered across the white carpet. Without a word, she turned and ran. Her massive gown dragged behind her. Her heels clicked frantically against the marble as she fled through the crowd and out the side door. Gone. The guests watched her leave, but no one followed. The applause for Grace continued. Victor stood there, frozen. His face was a mixture of shock, anger, and shame. He slowly walked toward Grace. His steps were heavy. His confidence was gone. "Grace," he said quietly. His voice was almost a whisper. I had no idea. If I had known who you were." Grace gently raised her hand, stopping him. "You didn't need to know who I was," she said calmly. "You just needed to treat me like a human being. That's all any of us need." Her words hit him like a hammer. Victor looked down. For the first time, he seemed small, powerless. Grace's eyes moved across the crowd. She saw the waiters, the security guards, the catering staff standing along the edges of the room. People just like her. People who worked hard. People who were often invisible. "I didn't come here for revenge," Grace said, her voice clear and strong. "I didn't come to ruin anyone's wedding." She paused, letting her words settle over the room. "I came to remind all of you that the people you walk past, the people you ignore, the people you treat like they're invisible, they have stories. They have histories. They have dignity." The room was completely silent now. Some of us have lost everything. Some of us have been broken. Some of us are just trying to survive. Her voice grew softer, but somehow even more powerful. But that doesn't make us less than you. It just makes us human. A woman in the crowd wiped tears from her eyes. A man in an expensive suit looked down at his shoes, ashamed. The catering staff stood taller. The security guards lifted their heads. Because in that moment, they were seen. Truly seen. Victor cleared his throat. His voice cracked when he spoke. "You're right," he said. "And I'm sorry. Truly sorry." He turned to the crowd. "Everyone here needs to hear this. My wife was wrong. I was wrong. We treated Grace like she was nothing. And that is something I will regret for the rest of my life." He looked back at Grace. "If you ever decide to rebuild the Daniels Hope Initiative, I want to help. Whatever you need. Funding. Resources. Connections. Just say the word." Grace studied his face. She could see he meant it. "Thank you," she said simply. Then, from the crowd, more people stepped forward. A businesswoman in a red dress raised her hand. "I want to help too. Your foundation changed my cousin's life. Let me give back." A man in a sharp suit nodded. "Count me in. We need organizations like yours in this city." One by one, people offered support. Money. Time. Resources. Grace felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Real, genuine hope. The older gentleman who had first recognized her stepped forward again. "Grace," he said warmly, "your father would be so proud of you. Not because of what you built, but because of who you are. Even after everything you lost, you never lost yourself." Grace's eyes filled with tears. But she didn't let them fall. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." She looked around the room one last time. At the chandeliers. At the expensive decorations. At the designer clothes and jewelry. All of it beautiful. All of it expensive. But none of it as valuable as the dignity she had carried inside herself all these years. Grace took a deep breath. "I should go," she said softly. Victor nodded. "Of course. And Grace, thank you for reminding us what really matters." As Grace turned to leave, the crowd parted. But this time, it wasn't because they thought she didn't belong. It was because they were honoring her, showing respect, recognizing royalty. Grace walked slowly toward the exit, her head held high, her step steady. She didn't look back. She didn't need to, because she had already reclaimed everything that mattered. Not her money, not her status, not her old life, but something far more important. Her identity, her dignity, her truth. Outside, Diane was waiting by the car. She was leaning against the door, arms crossed, a proud smile on her face. When she saw Grace walking down the grand staircase, she stood up straight. "So," Diane called out, "how did it go?" Grace reached the bottom of the stairs. She paused. Then she smiled. A real smile. Full of peace. Full of strength. "I remembered," Grace said softly. "Remembered what?" Diane asked. Grace looked up at the sky. The sun was setting, painting everything in gold and orange. "I remembered who I am," she said. "And that no one can ever take that away from me." Diane laughed, her eyes shining with tears. "Damn right they can't," she said, pulling Grace into a hug. They stood there for a moment, two women who had survived, who had fought, who had refused to be erased. Then they got into the car. As they drove away from the Rosewood Grand Estate, Grace looked out the window. The city lights were starting to twinkle. Chicago was coming alive. And so was she. Not as the woman she used to be, not as the woman people thought she was, but as the woman she had always been, deep down. Grace Daniels. A woman who had been knocked down but never broken. A woman who carried her crown not on her head, but in her heart. And that crown? No one could ever take it away. 3 months later, Grace stood in front of a building she thought she'd never see again. It was an old community center on the south side of Chicago. Brick walls. Faded paint. But good bones. Strong bones. This was where it all started. Where her father first taught her that real power doesn't come from money. It comes from service. Diane stood beside her, holding a folder full of papers. "Are you sure about this?" Diane asked gently. Grace nodded. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. After the wedding, word had spread quickly. The story of what happened at the Rosewood Grand Estate became legendary. The janitor who walked into a trap and came out a queen. People talked about it in coffee shops, on social media, in boardrooms. And slowly, people started reaching out. Old colleagues from the Daniels Hope Initiative, former scholarship recipients, business owners who wanted to give back, lawyers who offered to help clear the legal mess from years ago. Even Victor had kept his promise. He donated a significant amount of money and connected Grace with investors who believed in her vision. Within weeks, Grace had enough support to start rebuilding. Not the old foundation. Something new. Something stronger. She called it the Second Chance Initiative. Because if she could get a second chance, so could everyone else. The mission was simple: help people who had lost everything rebuild their lives with dignity. Single mothers trying to start businesses. Formerly incarcerated people looking for jobs. Immigrants seeking education. Young people who needed mentorship. Grace understood them all, because she had been them. Now, standing in front of this old building, she felt her father's presence. Her mother's voice. You were always meant for this, she could almost hear her mother say. Diane squeezed her shoulder. Ready to go inside? Grace smiled. Let's do this. They walked through the front door. Inside, a small group of people was waiting. Volunteers, board members, community leaders, all people who believed in Grace's vision. When Grace entered, they all stood up and applauded. Grace felt tears sting her eyes, but she blinked them away. Thank you all for being here, she said, her voice steady. 3 months ago, I was cleaning floors and emptying trash. I had accepted that this was my life, that I would be invisible forever. She paused, looking at each person in the room. But something happened that reminded me of a truth I had forgotten. Your circumstances don't define you. Your past doesn't limit you. And other people's opinions of you don't determine your worth. People nodded, some wiping tears from their own eyes. The room erupted in applause. Over the next several months, the Second Chance Initiative grew rapidly. They opened job training programs, offered microloans to entrepreneurs, provided free counseling services, created scholarships for students who had been overlooked by traditional systems. And Grace? She worked harder than she ever had in her life. But this time it was different. This time, she wasn't running from her past.
She was building on it.
She hired people who had been formerly incarcerated. She partnered with single mothers. She employed immigrants who struggled to find work, because she knew what it felt like to be counted out. One day, Grace received a letter. It was handwritten on expensive stationery. She opened it carefully. Dear Grace, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. What I did was cruel, inexcusable, and rooted in my own insecurity. Watching you walk into that wedding changed something in me. You showed me what real strength looks like, what real dignity looks like. I've filed for divorce. Victor and I both realized we were living a lie. A pretty, expensive lie, but a lie nonetheless. I've started volunteering at a women's shelter. I'm learning what it means to serve instead of just being served. I don't expect you to respond. I just wanted you to know that you changed my life, even though I tried to destroy yours. With deep regret and newfound respect. Vanessa. Grace read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her desk drawer. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel satisfaction. She just felt peace. Because forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about freeing yourself. A year after the wedding, the Second Chance Initiative held its first annual fundraising gala. This time, Grace was the one sending invitations. The event was held at the same Rosewood Grand Estate where everything had changed. But this time, Grace walked in as the guest of honor. She wore a simple black dress. Elegant, confident, powerful. Diane walked beside her, beaming with pride. Full circle, Diane whispered. Full circle, Grace agreed. The ballroom was packed. Business leaders, community activists, former scholarship recipients who were now doctors, lawyers, teachers. And in the back, quietly, respectfully, Vanessa sat alone. Grace saw her. Their eyes met across the room. Grace gave a small nod. Acknowledgement. Not friendship. Not forgiveness yet. But acknowledgement. Vanessa nodded back, tears in her eyes. When it was time for Grace to speak, she walked to the podium. The room fell silent. "A year ago," Grace began, "I was invited to a wedding. It was supposed to be my worst day. A day of humiliation and shame." She paused, letting the irony sink in. Instead, it became the day I remembered who I was. And more importantly, it became the day I decided to help others remember who they are too. The crowd erupted in applause. Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. "We live in a world that tells us our value is based on our job title, our bank account, our status. But I'm here to tell you that's a lie." She looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as she could. "Your value is in your humanity. Your worth is in your dignity. And nobody, I mean nobody, can take that away from you unless you let them." The applause was thunderous. As Grace stepped down from the podium, people rushed forward to shake her hand, to thank her, to tell her their own stories of second chances. Later that night, Grace stood on the balcony overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city lights twinkled like stars. Diane joined her, handing her a glass of water. "How does it feel?" Diane asked. "Being back on top?" Grace thought for a moment. Then she shook her head. "I'm not on top," she said softly. "I'm exactly where I belong. Serving, building, helping." She smiled, looking out at the city that had once forgotten her. "I spent years trying to be invisible because I thought that's what survival looked like. But I was wrong."
She turned to Diane.
"Real survival isn't about hiding. It's about rising. Again and again and again. No matter how many times you fall." Diane raised her glass. "To rising." Grace clinked her glass against Diane's. "To rising." They stood there in comfortable silence, two women who had survived the impossible. Below them, the Second Chance Initiative volunteers were cleaning up, laughing, sharing stories. People who had been given a second chance. People who were now giving second chances to others. The cycle of dignity continuing. Grace closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought about her parents, about everything she'd lost, about everything she'd found, and she smiled, because she finally understood the truth. You can lose,